Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, thanks a lot for sitting in on this. So, some of you are new, so I'll just say briefly a little bit about my background. I worked 26 years for the child welfare system in this state from 1978 to 2004, and 17 years of that I was in Spokane, and the rest of the time I was on this side of the state. I was a CPS caseworker, then a supervisor, then an area administrator, which is kind of like you probably know, building manager kind of person. I was a regional administrator in Region 6 for 7 years, and I also ran the training center, which at that point also had quality assurance for a couple of years too. Um, and then I went to University of Washington and ran a training and resource institute there for 5 years at the School of Social Work, taught in the MSW program, went to Casey Family Program, worked in a section called knowledge management there for 6 years. And then from 2016 until just recently, within the last month or two, I did training on a variety of subjects for child welfare caseworkers in this state, including on neglect, on critical thinking, on reunification, and on other subjects as well. So anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit here about services, and I invite you at any point to stop me. You can break in and ask a question, or you can put it in a chat box, and maybe if I miss it, Ryan can point it out. So you don't have to wait for me to stop, but I'll try to stop every 10 to 15 minutes at least and give people a chance to make comments or ask questions here. So what I'm going to do is just talk about some what I think are kind of basic kind of distinctions in service plans. I'm going to do that first, and then we're going to talk a little bit about safety planning here. And so again, what I'm going to do here is talk about service planning in the context of the kind of cases that you're involved in. That is the dependency actions, the court actions, and so of course there's a whole area of service planning that lies outside the court structure, and that is in-home kind of service plans, which parents agree to, and but what I'm going to talk about is more service planning once there's been a lot of times an emergency removal of a child and a shelter care hearing, and so sometimes now within the agency, within even for the last 20 years or so, a lot of these plans are developed, as you know, in family team meetings or in other kind of group formats, which when I worked for the agency wasn't always the case, but is increasingly the case now, not only in Washington, but in other states as well. So I guess the first thing I want to say, and then part of the reason I'm interested in this subject is because particularly in the light of the passage of the Keeping Families Together Act, the act that passed in 2021 and was implemented in the summer of 2023, that particular law has provisions for what courts can do at the shelter care hearing, depending on whether families have gotten into services or not. So that's what we're going to talk about now here. So particularly with the cases that you're involved with, most of those cases, not all of them, but most of them there would be a parent with a substance abuse, misuse kind of issue. Many times with a co-occurring disorder, of course, and a lot of times that would be a mood disorder. That would be depression, anxiety, PTSD. There would be a small group of parents who have mental health issues without without having a drug problem. That's not a lot, but there are some parents like that. And so in some of those cases, parents are already going to have been in services, perhaps, or they may have been referred from the hospital because of prenatal substance exposure. There may have been already talk about a plan of safe care, which we'll talk about here a little bit more in a minute. So there already may be some services that are ongoing, but a lot of times, of course, they're not. And so just a few kind of basic rules about any time you're doing service planning for parents that have chronically relapsing conditions, and that, of course, would involve drug and alcohol, but it is equally true of depression. It's equally true of anxiety and PTSD. Those mental health conditions are as chronically relapsing as substance abuse is. And when when parents are involved in those services and they become involved in them, and by the way, a lot of the skill around engagement in child welfare has to do with getting parents to actually enter these services in the first place and complete them. So just a really large number of parents, a large percentage of parents in the child welfare system who have already a diagnosis of substance abuse disorder, the SUD thing. Many of those parents are not involved in services. And so a recent study that came out within the last couple of years done by the data group at DCYF found that of all the parents who are involved in in-home services on a voluntary basis who had an SUD diagnosis, only about 40% of those parents had actually received any substance abuse service within the last 12 months. And of the parents who were involved in dependency actions, less than half, 49%, had received some kind of substance abuse service within the last 12 months or so. So the issue of engagement, of how to get people who, urgently need to get into treatment, to actually be willing to enter a program and complete a program. And by the way, entering a program is very different than completing a program. To say what must be a common sensey kind of thing, because a lot of people begin programs, but they do not complete them. And there have been a couple of studies in past years done in other states that found that particularly for parents in the child welfare system, the rule is that they have already been in treatment programs and left them. That is, whatever they do and relative to a child welfare intervention wouldn't be the first time that a lot of the parents had been in a substance abuse treatment program. In fact, that would be the exception rather than the rule. So the first idea here that I want to get across is just something really simple. Therapeutic services of the sort that are offered to people in drug treatment or in mental health treatment, or a lot of times for domestic violence as well, those services take time to have an effect on parental functioning. So maybe this just must sound completely obvious to many of you who may have had a background in substance abuse or mental health and so forth, but I think to a lot of decision makers in child welfare, it doesn't seem as intuitively obvious as that. So there has always been an idea in child welfare, even when I was there years and years ago, that if parents enter if they have a substance abuse issue and they enter drug treatment, or they have a mental health issue around, for example, depression, and they enter mental health treatment, that there's going to be an immediate effect on child safety, immediate positive effect on child safety. That is not true. So that's the first message that I want to get across here, that therapeutic services take time. And particularly when you're talking about a therapeutic services for a chronically relapsing condition, the expectation should be that is going to be a very rocky road. That is, any kind of treatment progress is going to be sort of usually on the model of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because again, that's the meaning of chronically relapsing condition. So the sort of the practical kind of meaning of this then, let me go back to that for just a second. I mean, what if you're a CASA, what if you're actually involved in a decision at shelter care that parents are going to agree to a service plan that involves entering one of these treatment programs, or continuing if maybe they've been in it a few weeks or a month or two and they're going to continue in it. And on that basis, the court is going to send a child home. I guess the idea I'm trying to get across is that for many of the families, that is a very reckless thing to do, even if they are highly motivated to complete that service. And by the way, many people, obviously under these conditions where, they really have to enter a treatment program to get their kids back, they may not be highly motivated other than the fact that they have to enter the program in order to get their child back. So for example, maybe somewhere like 2005, 2006, maybe even close to 20 years ago, there was there is a research study, again, in another area of the country that found that more than half of parents who entered a substance abuse treatment program at the time of a child welfare intervention, they never actually stopped using drugs and alcohol, despite the fact of entering the program and completing the program in many times, and also being certified as successfully completing the program. So there shouldn't be any assumption that because someone enters a treatment program, they're going to be clean and sober instantly, or that if they are clean and sober, that they're going to remain clean and sober for some substantial length of time, or that if they enter a program around depression, then immediately there's going to be a relief of depression symptoms. This is just very, very naive thinking. And so, of course, it's wishful thinking. It's we hope that the programs over time are going to have an effect. I mean, that's why we're asking parents to enter them here, right? But the idea that the effects are going to be instantaneous, that's unrealistic. That flies in the face of what it means to have a chronically relapsing condition. So what's kind of the practical kind of meaning of this? And so there are some research studies from past years, and some of them are quite old, because this is what I'm going to say now is a finding that's been repeated a number of times over a period of decades, which is that when it comes to the understanding of reentry into care rates. So for example, let's say you have a child who has been placed on an emergency basis into foster care, and after some period of time, either a few days, a few weeks, a few months, or longer, a child is reunified with a parent or with the parents then. So the finding is that the shorter the length of stay, the higher the rate of reentry. So I'm going to say this again. The shorter the length of stay, the higher the rate of reentry when you're talking about people having chronically relapsing conditions, for the kind of the obvious reasons that I've already stated here. Because therapeutic progress takes time. It's not an instantaneous kind of thing. And so this sort of the idea that shorter lengths of stay equal higher rates of reentry, that finding usually works up to about 6 months. That is, for stays less than 6 months, that's a rule, that's a finding that's been replicated in a number of studies. Once kids are in care for longer than that, for close to a year, then there isn't any particular difference in reentry into care rates for kids who've been in care a year as opposed to 2 years, or 9 months as opposed to 18 months. But for the first 6 months, that is very much of a standard sort of a guideline. Shorter lengths of stay equal higher rates of reentry. So before I go any further here, let me kind of stop and see if you have comments or questions here.
I can't find the thing that puts my hand up. So can I just ask?
Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
So that sort of seems to fly in the face of the Keeping Families Together law, because we're told we need to get them back to their families just as soon as possible if we can't absolutely prove that there is a risk or a safety hazard. You see what I'm saying?
So just a couple of comments here. So if kids are already in placement, if there's already been an emergency placement, then presumably that placement, applied the law, the Keeping Families Together Act, and so the child was believed to be or found to be at risk of imminent harm at the time that the child was placed. And so the question is, and then when would there be a sort of a good reason to believe that whatever the safety threat or safety reason was that led that child to be placed in care would no longer be operable? That is, we could assume that this child would be safe. And so what I'm saying is, parents entering services at shelter care is not one of those grounds. And so just from the standpoint of science and research, it's not adequate grounds for believing that a child is safe, right? So the reason I'm even giving this training, the reason I'm even talking about this subject is because I have heard continually from caseworkers and from others that this is the way the law is actually being applied in Washington to date. That is, lots of kids are in fact being returned at shelter care on the basis that families have agreed to a service plan, with the idea that that service plan is going to have instantaneous effects on child safety. Why would one believe that? What would be the grounds for believing that? Is what I'm asking here, right? So, of course, you end up having decisions made by judges who themselves aren't researchers. They're not child welfare experts. They're not scientists, but they're usually very, very smart people. They can learn just the way everyone else can, right? And so there needs to be kind of a willingness to at least look at evidence here. So of course, this comes to the question of then, well, what kind of if a therapeutic service is not going to have perhaps an instantaneous kind of a positive effect on child safety, what can be done in terms of safety plans? And so let's talk a little bit about that here for a second. And so I guess the first kind of distinction that I want to make here is between, I mentioned the concept of a therapeutic service. So the idea of a service that is going to gradually change people's ability to function in the world and to be better parents over some period of time. A therapeutic service is a process, right? I mean, that's the underlying kind of idea here. And even if it's not for example, let's say it's not even a substance abuse treatment program. Let's say it's a parenting skills education class or some skill-based kind of program that has the label of evidence-based here. The same rule goes for the development of skills. You learn skills gradually. You learn skills through practice. I'll come back to this subject in a minute here because so the idea that if people are learning how to be better, so if a person willingly enters a parenting education kind of program, and even if they're highly motivated to acquire those skills, right? A person gradually acquires skills through practice and over time. It isn't an instantaneous, I sign up for the program, and after the first session, I know how to parent. Again, such a weird idea, right? So such a strange idea. And of course, it's an idea that has its basis in ideology. It doesn't have its basis in research or science. So here, the question then becomes well, then what can be done in terms of safety plans here if therapeutic services are not going to have an instantaneous kind of effect, which they are not. And so the key idea in terms of safety-oriented services, so this is a concept, kind of a distinction that I want to offer here, the difference between therapeutic services and safety-oriented services. Therapeutic services, by their very nature, inherently take time in order to have a positive effect. But when you talk about safety-oriented services, you're talking about services that you presume and expect to have an instantaneous effect. And that doesn't mean that they would be 100% effective in achieving child safety, but they would have an immediate positive benefit. That's what it means to talk about a safety-oriented kind of a service here. So, well, what, for example, might some of those type of services be, as an example here? So, some of them are very, very simple. So for example, let's say that any of us in this training today, we have some kind of medical condition that can be affected by our food intake or by our diet. And a doctor just gives us some information that we're willing to follow. Stop eating X and eat Y. And we take that lesson to heart. And immediately it has an effect on our well-being. So it's possible that some types of information, if parents, again, take it to heart, can have an immediate effect on child safety. So let me give an example of what I mean there. So particularly for very, very young children and particularly for infants. And so probably, a number of you, maybe all of you, are familiar with the purple crying approach to helping parents to deal with the inconsolable crying of kids. And so why is inconsolable crying? Why is that such a risky thing for a lot of the infants that live in the families that we're dealing with here, because abuse-related child maltreatment fatalities are most of the time associated with it. They are a response to inconsolable crying of children. So that is an immediate kind of, in some families, not in all families, but in some families, that is a very definite kind of safety threat. So what I would be hoping would be happening is that, particularly the CPS staff that are dealing with the families on a regular basis, any kind of treatment professional is talking to family members about purple crying guidelines. And you can find those guidelines online, like I would, because I knew I was going to do this training today. I just went back and Googled purple crying this morning and yesterday, and there's very good information there. It's very simple, easy to understand. So purple crying, perhaps it's an acronym, right? So, if I can remember, P stands for persistent crying. U stands for unexpected crying, that is crying that doesn't seem to have any particular kind of cause. R stands for resistant, meaning that the kids are very difficult to soothe. The second P stands for painful face. L stands for lengthy. E stands for evening. So some of the kids, for example, who are engaged in, very inconsolable crying, so one of the pieces of information online is that kids described as having colic. What would be a guideline for understanding what that means? And so the simple guideline is to apply the rule of three there. So the rule of three, meaning that a child cries for at least 3 hours, at least 3 days out of a week, and for at least 3 weeks. 3, 3, 3, right? So imagine you have a child who's inconsolable for a period of 3 hours. And of course, that's just a minimum kind of a threshold for assigning this label. I mean, you have some kids who can cry for 4, 5, 6 hours or for the entire night. And so the inconsolable crying of children, in some, particularly infants, and infants, by the way, as you must know, are much elevated risk for child maltreatment death than any other age group. I mean, far and away, 2 to 3 times more likely to die of either abuse or related type of causes as is even a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old. So the inconsolable crying of infants. So you want to be giving people some information there about purple crying right off the bat, and that's everyone we're dealing with in child welfare who has an infant. We want this kind of information to be given to the person, right? So now that doesn't mean that information in and of itself would always be instantaneously effective or something, but it has the potential to have an immediate effect, both in helping parents to get some perspective on what their child's crying means. So the kids who are in the very, very most risky kind of situation when they have this issue with inconsolable crying is when a parent is hearing a child's crying as a form of rejection or accusation because of their own childhoods, because of their own issues. So when they are projecting that kind of meaning onto crying, then a child can be in mortal danger there, particularly when parents are not able to console kids. So we want parents who have open child welfare cases, who have infants in them, to be at least have the information, the purple crying information, both about the meaning of crying and that it is not a way of a baby rejecting you or accusing you. And something about when it happens. For example, the purple crying guideline is that kids are more likely to have inconsolable crying in the first couple of months of life, and that these kind of crying jags tend to reduce in frequency and in extent when kids are in the 3 to 4 or 5 month old age range. So it's not something that most parents are going to have to live with for their entire first year of life or something. So yeah, so you want some. So that's an example of a type of information. Maybe call it a service if you want to, but a type of information that has the potential to have an immediate positive effect on child safety, and which should be given to 100% of parents who have open CPS cases when they have infants in their care. So that is an example. Another example is to give parents information about safe sleep. And it is still the case that in some states in this country, no longer in Washington, but for a lot of years in Washington, during the period I left the child welfare system in 2004, I would say that, from the next 10 years or so, the most common reason that children died in child maltreatment deaths was rollover kind of deaths, where parents were either sleeping with kids or else they were putting kids in sleeping situations that did not respect guidelines from the safe sleep kind of guidance here. And so again, these guidelines are available online. You can Google them. It's easy. It's simple. Everyone does. The guidelines are really, really simple. Everyone can understand it. So kids should not be put in situations where they're sleeping with toys, animals, pillows, anything that can smother them. They shouldn't be. They should sleep on their backs. There are guidelines for how tightly sheets should be. A mattress should come up to the edge of a crib. I mean, really simple, easy, doable kind of stuff that has the potential to actually save kids' lives. Now, the unfortunate thing that has been found in some states, and I think in this state as well, particularly in terms of the safe sleep stuff, is that just giving people information in and of itself doesn't tend to be enough. And therein lies the problem with safety plans around. So it's absolutely necessary to give people this kind of information. It isn't enough just to give them information. Those kind of messages have to be reinforced a number of times. So there has to be sort of a recognition that some parents will, for example, sleep with kids because that meets their own emotional needs. Or in some cases, because it is a part of their culture. They may have come from some part of the world where that's the way you parent kids. And so a lot of times, just give people information is not enough, but it is a sort of a necessary element there. So that's one kind of approach to safety that, at least in a potential kind of way, has an immediate can have an immediate kind of effect. Okay, so before I go any further here, let me stop and see if you have comments or question here. Okay, so let me talk about a couple of other kind of safety plans here that have the potential to have an immediate kind of effect here, right? So any kind of service that's going to immediately reduce parental stress or is going to reduce material hardship has the potential to immediately increase child safety. So this is particularly true of very impoverished parents, parents who don't, can't pay for their electricity, don't have enough to eat. And by the way, a surprisingly large percentage of parents who have open cases in child welfare systems, appallingly high percentage of those parents have food insecurity. That is, they don't necessarily know where the next meal is coming from. They may not be eating three meals a day at all. So how in the world you can have child welfare system in the United States intervene around neglecting families all over the place and leave families food insecure is simply beyond me. I mean, it's just, I can't even imagine what anyone can be thinking, either from a policy standpoint or from a practitioner kind of standpoint. So insofar as families have immediate concrete needs for food, for shelter, for medical or dental care, for clothing, to be able to provide, some of those kind of essentials can have an immediate effect on child safety. And so we ought to be thinking about that, whenever we're dealing with families. Are there any obvious unmet concrete needs? So before I say anything more about it, let me just kind of stop here and see if you have other comments or questions here on the safety planning part of things. Okay, so the usual theme in child
Dee.
welfare, yeah.
Teresa had a question. Teresa, go ahead.
Okay.
It's just on that topic, with all the cases I've had, there's a transition. So a lot of times they may be a drug dealer, that was their source of income, or they may have a job, and now that they have all these court services, they can't work. And so now they can't pay bills, they can't buy groceries, or they sell their car to help with the expenses. And so food insecurity, housing insecurity. So they're trying to, fulfill all those court requirements to get their kids back and to get healthy, but they're not familiar with all the opportunities in our county. So one of the things is that, myself and everybody else, we all are trained, but we have nonprofits that help with housing and transportation and food and clothing. But when they come into the system, they're not aware of all that. So they have all those basic needs and that are not being met. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and that would be true of really a lot of the families here. So let me just remind you of one stat here so this study is kind of old, but it was done in 2008, 9, something like that at the University of Washington. So this was a study that looked at 800 or 900 families with open child welfare cases in Washington, and that included families where kids remained in the home, and a lot of kids in foster care as well here. So that study, which again, kind of old at this point, but still it had some really shocking information there that half of the families had incomes less than $10,000 a year. So they weren't just poor, they were severely poor. And if the kids in foster care, 60% of the families had incomes less than $10,000 a year. So even in 2008, 9, 10, that was being severely, not just poor, that was being severely poor. So issues around the extent to which parents are able to take advantage of community services. That is, and not just some of them offered by the state through TANF, other kind of programs, through food stamps and whatever, but also other services that are in the community. That takes a certain amount of social skill. That takes a certain amount of energy, which a lot of times the depressed parents just don't have. And they also don't have the social skills. They don't have the social self-confidence. So what affects, if you set up a system where the parents who are most able to reach out and go to these agencies and present their needs in a civil kind of way and ask for help in a courteous kind of way, they're of course more likely to receive help than families who simply don't have the energy to do that. And if they don't have the social skills to talk with people in civil ways, just can't access the services that are actually there in the community, right? So that is where really that's a lot of the engagement issue, I think, in child welfare. That is, a lot of the families really need help in accessing the services that are already there in the community. And in the absence of that help, what's going to happen is that the parents who are the most skilled. So if you take any group of troubled people, I don't care what it is, troubled by virtue of drug and alcohol, troubled by virtue of mental health issues, troubled by virtue of interpersonal violence, cognitive impairments, whatever it is, whatever the nature of the trouble is, there are going to be some people in that group that are better functioning than others. And so the people who are the better functioning in the group are the people who are going to get the most services because they're able to reach out and to do the things it takes to get those services. And so particularly child welfare systems need to pay attention to the families who are not, so to speak, the cream of the crop there in any particularly kind of troubled group and helping them to, so that's one comment. The second comment is, if child welfare systems are going to be more sort of family friendly, and if they're actually going to be sort of the source of assistance to families, they have to beef up the economic benefits that they have to offer families. And so this is sort of the simple way to reform child welfare in this country in a way that is going to make a referral to child welfare sometimes seem like a benefit rather than like a punishment. When child welfare systems have lots of benefits to offer people who are really, really needy, then it isn't going to be viewed as a family misfortune that someone gets referred to a CPS program, as it often is now. So that's sort of the second idea here. So yeah, so a lot of times the economic services can have an immediate kind of effect, and particularly for the very severely poor families. And remember, that's a lot of the families. Now, one other stat I want to offer you here is that during the same kind of time period that I was mentioning before, in 2008, there was a very, very excellent descriptive study published on racial disproportionality in Washington State. And that study was done by the Public Policy Institute. They're the entity that does studies for the legislature. That particular study, one of its sort of throwaway findings at the end of that study was that about 4/5 of the parents who had kids in foster care were single parents. 4/5. And single parents are markedly poorer than two-parent families on average. So this is sort of the third kind of idea around safety-oriented services that I want to offer here, particularly given that we're dealing with children in foster care with a lot of single-parent families. We want to be able, particularly when those kids go back either through in a reunification process or even to prevent placement in the first place, we want to focus on reducing child care burden as a safety-oriented service. So I say this again, particularly for the single-parent families, but also for some of the two-parent families as well, but particularly for the single-parent families. We want to think about a safety-oriented services that reduces child care burden. So what does that mean? It means that we provide ample amounts of child care, hopefully of a high quality, that we provide respite care on demand, that we hopefully in some communities have crisis nurseries, as for example, the Spokane has a Vanessa Behan, a crisis nursery there, which is a sort of a model of what's possible there. So, a whole range of services here that are going to reduce child care burden on single parents. That is a safety-oriented service because it has the potential to have an immediate effect on child safety. And by saying it has the potential, I don't mean that it always does. That's not what I'm saying here, but it has the potential because it's meeting a concrete need there in a very immediate kind of a way here. So let me stop here before we go any further and see if you have a comment or question here.
Dee, there's a question in the chat. What kind of safety service plan elements are appropriate for physically abusive parents?
Okay, again, this depends a little bit on the age of child here, which is, I'm going to say something more about that here in a minute, but particularly now I can say a little bit about it now maybe. So the big problem, of course, with safety planning as a sort of is that, one, there's very little science around it. So first I want to say that it's mostly practice wisdom. And I don't discount the importance of practice wisdom. I mean, that's important in child welfare as it is in every other area of work there, but it's not the same as having a science to depend on. So therein lies the problem. So the idea here that in the absence of any research thing, that we can have 100% confidence in safety plans, that's just impossible because there isn't a research basis for having that kind of confidence here. But when we're talking about very little kids, when we're talking about infants and toddlers, we need the plans to be just about 100% effective because the kids are so incredibly vulnerable. So as kids get somewhat older, then there's a larger margin for error there because even then, if a safety plan doesn't work out for, say, a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old child, right? And maybe there's another abusive kind of incident, there's there's a reduced chance that there's going to be a severe injury there, or that there's going to be a death just by virtue of the age of the child there. So part of the issue having to do with safety planning has to do with the issue of age here. And so particularly for infants and toddlers, absent good science and research on this particular subject, when there are active safety threats in those children's lives, I just do not believe that betting the life of children on a safety plan, I just view that as being reckless. But at the same time, that's actually what's going on in this state as we speak, that very thing. So, so that's kind of the first thing. And before I'm going to come back to the physical abuse thing here in just a minute, but I want to talk about a couple of other things too. The second thing in child welfare is that for safety plans to be done well, they are labor-intensive kind of plans. That is, they really take a lot of time to really do well. And so in recent years, for example, child welfare policy in this state and most other states has been that if there is a written in-home safety plan, then a caseworker has to visit the family on a once-a-month basis. That is a ridiculous policy. If there's really a safety threat to a child, you can't be visiting a child on a once-a-month basis. There have to be a minimum of weekly visits, and a lot of times there need to be visits every day or every other day. That's why I say that safety planning is a very labor-intensive kind of an activity there if it's done well. So it's not sort of an alternative to doing a lot of work here. I mean, it is added work. And that's why, for the most part, if a caseworker has more than 2 or 3 families where they're doing safety plans, they're not going to be able to do them well. And so this is sort of the other aspect of this from the standpoint of an infrastructure thing, is that there needs to be private agencies or staff that are devoted totally to the implementation of safety plans. That is, if we are going to use safety plans as an alternative to foster care, then there needs to be a whole infrastructure devoted to the implementation of safety plans, if that's really going to be the alternative to placement there. The practice wisdom over the years in child welfare has been that we should not be depending on the promises of parents as a sort of the central sort of part of safety plans. So for example, the promise that I promise not to use physical punishment on my child, and maybe a parent even signs that promise. Or even in a more ridiculous way, you know, you might have a safety plan that says, I promise not to use fentanyl when my child is in the apartment, or something crazy like that. You know, so the idea has been in child welfare is that promises are sort of like worthless or feckless and so forth. I have a little bit of a different idea, and I think particularly speaking to the issue of physical abuse. I think a lot of times it is very helpful to elicit promises from parents around the nature of physical abuse that they will do or not do in relationship to a child. You just cannot depend 100% on the promise. That is, so for example, if a parent is any kind of abuse of an infant of the smallest sort, that is, pinching the face, slapping a child. If a child is below 2 years old, that really should be looked on as a sort of a red alert kind of a thing here. That's what's described as a sentinel injury kind of thing there, right? And that kind of behavior should not be ignored. That is the indication of a safety threat a lot of the time there, right? So in those instances where parents are using excessive punishment, and a lot of what goes as abuse in this in child welfare systems is really what I would call excessive punishment. It really is a form of discipline. It's just excessive there. I think a lot of times it does make sense to elicit written promises from parents that they will not engage in certain types of physical punishment. But at the same time, you just cannot totally depend on that. There have to be, so the idea has been for a safety plan to be effective, there has to be safety monitoring. And that has been the sort of the basic kind of idea in child welfare now for 15 years. That is, promises don't work. You've got to have safety monitors there. But who actually is going to be a safety monitor? And again, there's not good science on this subject, but the anecdotal kind of issues there are that if you depend, for example, on relatives, to be safety monitors. And a lot of times they just don't do what they say they're going to do in written plans. So if you're using promises, I guess what I'm saying is there has to be follow-up there. So that's kind of part of it. Issues around placing children into childcare, very young children into childcare, that ought to be a part of safety plans when kids are in the preschool kind of age range. And there's a concern with physical punishment. Those kids should be in childcare for as many hours a day as the parents will accept if it's a voluntary kind of a deal there. So the distinction I think that I sort of want to get across here, particularly in the physical abuse area, is there's a very large difference both in dynamic and in threat between what is typically described as battered child syndrome and excessive punishment. So I spent decades working in child welfare where child abuse was just viewed as homogeneous, just all of a type, but it's not. Very distinct types of physical abuse. And so, short version, there's no way to protect children from battered child syndrome. Once anything that is a part of that syndrome has happened, kids have got to be removed. I mean, and no second chances, no warnings, nothing. I mean, if infants or toddlers are being shaken, if they're being hit, slapped on or about the face, if they're being punched in any kind of way, they have to be removed, period, right? On the other hand, when you're talking about excessive punishment, much less severe injuries and the kind of injury that occurs when kids are being spanked too hard on the buttocks or the lower back or something, that is a completely different type of physical abuse. And many times those cases can be handled without placing kids into foster care, right? In part through services, which I'll talk about here in a minute here, and also through the safety plan kind of a deal there. So I guess one of the things I'm saying here is one of the things you want to do in physical abuse cases is you want to be able to classify the type of abuse that's being done to the kid accurately. And so there is a good typology of physical abuse that, probably 20, 25 years old, that I think is that offers the best kind of guidelines on this particular subject. But the most important distinction to understand is the difference between battered child syndrome and excessive punishment first. Now, from the standpoint of services for particularly excessive punishment kind of cases, one of the very positive things that have happened in child welfare in the last 15 years is that there are now pretty good evidence-based programs for dealing with excessive punishment. And one of those programs is PCIT, which this state hopefully still offers. I mean, so an evidence-based program for dealing with excessive punishment. Not a program for dealing with battered child syndrome. Not a program for dealing with child torture, which is something else here. So yeah, let me stop there before I go any. We're going to run out of time here. Let me stop here and see if you have a comment or question. And by the way, these guidelines that I mentioned, the typology for physical abuse, I will find this typology and I'll send it to Ryan. He can send it out. So it's very useful. It probably isn't more than 8 or 9 pages, 8, 9 or 10 pages. It is actually the best typology that has the best kind of guidelines for understanding meaningful distinctions among types of physical abuse that I've ever found. And the reason it's valuable is that it's operational. It's not an academic type of a typology. It has practical kind of guidelines for what to do when you're dealing with these various types of physical abuse here. So I want to stop here for a second, see if you have a comment or question here.
I don't want to talk too much, but is it okay if I make another
Yeah.
comment? Okay. One of the things that I found really helpful when I'm working with families is when they have the support groups and they're in their care, because they're dealing with a family history of addictions, child abuse, and so they can't go to parents, aunts and uncles, siblings. So when they're in the court services and social services, they are learning new skills so that they won't abuse and neglect their children, and then they have their peers that are in the support group to help them to be successful as a parent. And then when I work with them, then I remind them, and then I go through, so like a hypothetical situation, like what happens if your child is screaming for 3 hours, and what are you going to do? Are you going to call this person? Are you going to call me? And maybe they're cutting a tooth, and trying to help them think and to have skills so that they won't lose their temper and abuse a child, that type of thing.
So just a couple, we're going to run out of time here, but just a couple of comments there because the comments there are good here. So the first one is that we, and I don't know who we exactly, whether that means caseworkers, CASAs, other people who work with families, there needs to be someone that when a parent is desperate, they have someone that they can actually call. That is, if someone is desperate about being unable to comfort a child or to soothe a child, then you want that person to have someone to reach out to. You want a phone number. You want someone to call to say, what do I do in this situation? My child's been crying the entire night. So that is a resource that we ought to be able to offer every parent that we're dealing with here. So that first. The second thing is, whenever we're helping people to develop skills, I mean, the main lesson from evidence-based programs over the last decade or two is that if you want people to develop skills, then you need to offer them coaching, not just advice. You need to offer them coaching. You need them to give them the opportunity to exercise skills in the presence of an expert coach. And the key thing about sort of reinforcing skills is that it needs to be done immediately and often. So if you want to change parent behavior, use the same rules if you want to change child behavior. That is, you want the reinforcement to be immediate and you want it to be frequent. So there is a kind of a formula for how you change oppositional child behavior into cooperative child behavior. And that formula is you offer way, way more praise than you offer punishment, way, way more. And that's what you're trying to teach parents to do in most of the evidence-based programs. You're trying to change the ratio of praise to punishment. The same thing goes for how we're dealing with parents when we want to teach them new skills, right? And so everyone can use the opportunity. If you see parents who are interacting with kids very appropriately and very sensitively and responsively, we never want to let that go without commenting on it. You always want to recognize that. You always want to praise that. That's how you strengthen skills. That is, people do the right thing and someone notices that they did the right thing. And it can just be very, very simple and quick. That was great what you did with your kid. That was so sensitive. That was so kind. That was so thoughtful. You say this and to offer that kind of praise and reinforcement over and over and over again, right? The problem becomes when you're faced with behavior that you cannot ignore. And that is where a lot of the therapeutic art comes with changing an oppositional child's behavior, because as kids get somewhat older, it's very hard to ignore a lot of the behavior. I mean, that's what a lot of the advice books tell you, is that you want to reinforce good behavior, you want to ignore bad behavior. But as kids get older, you can't always ignore the bad behavior. I mean, and so the question is, how do you respond to bad behavior while at the same time recognizing the good behavior? So yeah, so with parents, a lot of recognition for what they're doing well, and particularly in the early stages of treatment and services, right? And so to say this again in response to physical abuse kind of thing, when you're dealing with excessive punishment, you do want to get, my opinion, you do want to get parents to agree to not to do certain kind of things, but you also got to offer them alternatives. That is, they have to have alternative skills for how to deal with someone, right? And so maybe the last comment, and then we'll kind of stop here. So when I was in child welfare a lot of the time, I sort of had this idea when I was working with parents that if parents needed to learn how to respond to bad behavior without hitting a child and so forth. So a lot of times I would try to teach them to use timeout in the same way that I did with my kids, most of my peers were doing. And then, of course, we've discovered here in recent years that for traumatized kids, that's not what you want parents to be doing. You don't want them to be using time out for traumatized kids. You want them to be using time in for traumatized kids. That is to stay in contact with you. So, of course, a lot of the kids that we're dealing with in child welfare that's why we're involved with them. They've been through trauma. So one of the things that's very, very helpful then to do then is to offer parents information about how to help kids who are engaged in bad behavior, engaged in meltdown, particularly an emotion dysregulation thing, without isolating them. So what's an alternative to isolating them? If we don't want parents hitting them and we don't want parents isolating them, what do we want parents to do? And there is good information out there, and I've mentioned the Deborah Gray book, the Nurturing Adoption book before, and lots of other resources as well on that particular subject. So we need to help parents to know how to deal with emotion dysregulation in kids. And inconsolable crying is one of those examples of emotional dysregulation. And when your kids get a little bit older, of course, it's tantruming and screaming and horrible kind of fits there. So I think with that, I'm going to stop. And then, so the thing I promised to do is I'm going to find the typology of physical abuse that I mentioned. I'm going to send that to Ryan, who can send it to all of you. And I'll also send you the name of a couple of resources there, the ones I mentioned, the Deborah Gray book. So let me stop there and give you a chance for any last comment or question kind of here.